Good morning. Today let's build React Firebase Albums application. We're going to create a fairly ugly application where you can create albums. Each album can contain different images. You can pick new images from your computer, upload them, and they will be displayed in your album. The first image in the album will be used as a thumbnail. Create a new React app, npx create React app Firebase albums. Let's create new Firebase project. Firebase projects create. Let's call it FRB albums. Yes. Now let's go to the Firebase console, and we want to enable two features. First, we want storage to store our images. Press get started. Next. Pick the location. Done. Now you want to go to the rules and temporarily remove the request auth. Publish. Now you want to go to the database. Create a database. Start in test mode. Next. Done. Now let's go back to the console. Now let's go to Firebase Albums application. cd Firebase Albums. Run Firebase init. We are going to use the Firestore and the storage. Enter. Use an existing project. Firebase Albums. Store the rules in the Firestore rules. Default for indexes. Default for storage. And now we need to create a Firebase web application. Run Firebase apps create. We need to create a web application. We also call it FRB albums. Now we can get the config and output the value to src base.js. Now let's open the project. Open storage rules. Remove the authentication requirement. Open src base.js. We need to install the Firebase package. Yarn add Firebase. Now remove the commented lines. Import Firebase from Firebase and import storage. Import Firebase storage. Now we need to export the initialized app. Export const app equals Firebase initialize app. Now let's go to app.js and create the application layout. Remove the old layout. I'm going to be using MVP CSS for styles because it's just quicker and easier. Download them. Copy them to the project. Downloads, MVP CSS, src. Go to index.js and import MVP CSS. Go back to app.js. And now let's create the layout. Let's define a section. Inside of it we will define asides. There will be containers for our album panels. Inside of each album panel we will render a header with the title of this album, album name, and also an image, src. I will temporarily use placeholder kittens as images. Copy the URL and paste it as src. Alt, album, let's use the square image, 200 by 200, and let's copy aside a couple of times. Let's see how it looks. I think it's okay for now. Go back to the code. Let's wrap the section into a fragment, and below the section let's add an input, type text, and a button, create album. Wrap them both into a footer, and format the document. And now let's define a state that will hold our albums. Const albums set albums equals use state, and by default it will be an empty array. Now in our code, instead of manually adding a bunch of asides, let's map through the albums, map, album, and we return our aside layout here. Instead of this generic text, we will return an actual album name, and instead of the image src, we return album image. The key will be album name. Now let's temporarily add one default album name first album image, and let's copy the image of the placeholder kitten. Remove all the other asides, and let's see if our application works. Go back to the code. Now import app from the base. This is our pre-configured Firebase app. Now define db equals app Firestore. And now let's subscribe to the changes in the database. Define a new use effect. Use effect, pass a callback. Inside of it, db collection. Our collection will be called albums. On snapshot. And here, every time we get an update that we'll get in this callback, we define a new const to hold the albums. Temp albums equals an empty array. Now we iterate over the snapshot. Snapshot for each document in the snapshot. We push the document data to our temp albums. And after we're done, we set albums to the new temp albums array. Now remove the default album from our state, so it will be an empty array by default. Create a new file, call it new album form.js. Import React from React, import app from base, const db equals app Firestore, export const new album form equals a component, and inside of this component we will render our input and a button. Let's move them to this new album form, wrap them into a fragment, call return, format the document. Now we want to have a state, const album name, set album name equals, use state, empty string by default, input value equals album name, on change, we get an event, and we call set album name event target value. Now when we click on the button, on click, we want to call a function, and we want to add a new item to the albums collection. We call db collection with two L's, albums doc album name, set name album name. Let's wrap our expression into curly braces, and before we add an item to the collection, let's check if we have the album name. If album name, actually if not album name, then return. And then after we've added a new item to our collection, let's clear the album name input. Set album name empty string. Now let's go to app.js, and in our footer let's use our new album form. Now let's go to the browser, create a new test album, create album, and here we go. For now it doesn't have an image, so now we want to start handling image uploads, and we're going to use the first album image as its cover. Let's go back to the code. Let's tidy up our new album component. Let's create a new callback on album name change equals a function that handles an event, and here we still call the set album name, and let's pass this on album change function here. Also let's create a callback for on click, const on album create equals a function, and here we copy the code from the on click function, pass the on album create to on click handler, and format the document. We want to be able to open the individual albums and see what photos do we store there, so we will need some sort of routing. Let's install React Router DOM. Yarn add React Router DOM. Now go to index.js, import browser router from React Router DOM. Wrap your application into browser router and format the document. Now in our app, in the bottom of our layout, let's define a switch statement with the routes for each album. Albums, map, album, and here we'll define a new route. And for each route we will need an album ID. So let's go back to the useEffect function. Also right now our useEffect triggers on every component update. That's not very good. Let's add an empty array in the end, so that it will be triggered only once when we mount the component. And here, instead of just pushing the doc data that doesn't contain the ID, let's destructure the doc data. And now, after the data, we can add the ID from doc ID. Now each of our albums in our state will contain the album ID as well. we can refer to it in our path, which will be a template string album ID. And let's close the tag. Each album route will render an album component. Component equals album. And let's create this album component. New file, album.js, import React from React, export const album equals a new function, return, and for now let's just return text album. Let's get back to the app, import album from album, and now let's make each album preview a link to the album route. So let's write each aside into link to, and here we'll use a template string album ID and close the tag. Format the document. Now we need to move the whole layout except for the switch to a separate component. Let's create a new component, new file, home.js, import React from React, export const home equals a new functional component. Now we go to app.js, we get all the layout except switch, remove it, and instead paste it here, wrap it into a fragment, return. Now import link from React Router DOM, import new album form from new album form, and now we need the albums list. And let's get it through the props. Albums, wrap it into the curly braces. Now let's go back to the app, and inside of the switch render another route, path equals / exact render, and here we want to return our home component and we pass albums to it. Close the tag. Now let's go to the album component, and what we want to do here is we want to render all the photos that we have in this album. So let's copy the home layout because it will be very similar to one from the home layout. Paste it instead of the album text. Instead of albums there will be photos. We won't have a title, so we remove h3, and it's not going to be a link, so we can remove the link as well. In the footer we'll have a new photo component, new photo, and it will need to know the current album ID. Current album equals, for now it will be an empty string. We're gonna get the current album ID from the router. To be able to do this, we need to go back to the app.js, and now instead of mapping over the albums and creating a separate route for each of them, we're gonna remove this part, and we're gonna use the segment path. It will look like this, / album. Now go back to album.js, and here we will use route match to get the album ID. Const match equals use route match. The route is / album. Now we can get the album from match params. Now let's define the state for the photos. Const photos set photos equals use state, and it will be an empty array by default. Now we can pass the album to the current album, and let's define the new photo component. New file, new photo.js, import React from React, export const new photo equals a function, and for now let's return a fragment with text new photo. Go back to the album, import new photo from new photo, and now let's load the photos for specific album. You can copy the use effect from app.js, go to album.js, paste it here, import use effect from React. We'll also need to copy the db from the app, paste it here, and import app from base. Now instead of setting the albums value, we need to set the photos value. Set photos, and we need to subscribe to updates in specific document, doc album. Now let's remake the callback. Here we are getting the doc document. Let's remove the for each. Now let's get the photos from the document. Photos equals doc data photos. Now remove the temp albums, and actually we can set photos to be doc data photos, and remove this temp albums push. Format the document, and now let's start uploading the photos. Go to the new photo component, add an input, type file. We want to track its on change event, on change, on file change. define the onFileChange callback. Const onFileChange equals a function that receives an event, and inside of it we're gonna get the file. Const file equals event target files 0. Actually, we will want to save it in the state, so let's define a new state. Const file set file equals use state default value null. Import use state from React, and now instead of creating a new constant, we're gonna set file to whatever it is in the event files. Now let's add a button that will say upload image. We'll listen to its onClick event on upload. Let's define this callback. Const onUpload equals function, and here we'll need to import the app from the base. We need to get the Firestore db equals app Firestore, and we also need the storage. Const storage equals app storage. Now inside of the file upload, we need to get the reference to the storage. Const storage ref equals storage ref. Now we need to create a file ref. Const file ref equals storage ref child file name, and then file ref put file. Let's make onUpload function asynchronous, async. Now we can await until the file reference is uploaded, and after it's done we can call db collection albums document album, and the reference to the album we get from the props. As you remember, inside of the album component we're passing the current album prop. Now inside of the new photo we can get it from the props, current album doc current album dot update, and here we want to update the field images. Import Firebase from Firebase, and to update images we are getting Firebase Firestore field value array union, and here we pass a new object, name equals file name, URL equals await file ref get download URL. Save the document. Now every time we press the upload image button, we will upload the file to the storage, get its download URL, and update the albums collections by adding a new image to the images array with name that we got from file name and URL that we got from the download URL. Now let's get back to the album.js, and instead of photos we will now use images. Let's rename photos to images. Let's also rename the constants. Images set images. Here in the loop we also use images now. Images image image name and image URL, and here we call set images. Now let's go to the browser and test if it works. We're now inside of the test album. Let's choose the file. I'm gonna choose one of my previous thumbnails, open, upload image, and it works. Let's try to upload more images. React Redux PNG, open, upload image. Here you go, we have 2 images in this album. Let's also display the album title and the link back to the main page. Above the section, let's render the header. Let's create a new state, album name, set album name. By default it will be an empty string, and inside of the onSnapshot we will set album name doc data name, and now inside of the header we can render album name, and let's close the tag. Let's move header inside of the section, wrap it inside of the header tag, format the document. Let's open the browser to see if it works. Now let's add the link to the home page. Let's add a paragraph with text go to the link home page, and link to equals root. Import link from the React Router DOM. Let's see how it works. Click the home page. We have the test album, and now we want to render the first image of the album as its thumbnail. Go back to the code, go to app.js, go to home.js, and here we will say album images 0 URL. Go back to the browser, and as you can see, now we render the first image as a thumbnail. Newly created albums won't have any images in them, so let's create a fallback in case if we didn't add any images yet. So we say album images. If they exist, then we render the album images URL. Otherwise, we render empty string. Don't forget to remove the listener to onSnapshot on unmount. To do it, we save it to an unmount variable, const unmount equals onSnapshot, and then we return it from our useEffect. The function that you return from the useEffect callback will be called when component will be unmounted. And let's do the same for the album useEffect. Const unmount equals return unmount. Now go to the browser and let's create another album. Let's call it another album. Create album. Now let's try to upload images to it. Go to another album, choose file. Let's pick something code split PNG. Open, upload image. Now we have a new image in this album. Let's go to home page. This album now has thumbnail, and you can navigate between the albums, going back to home page, add new images like server push.png, open, upload image, and here you go. Thank you for watching this video. If you want to pick the topic for the next video, join my Discord server. The link is in the description. See you next time.